Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. Tonight, we're going to travel across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean and discover different mysterious places or phenomena. But first, allow me to take a few seconds of your time to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project. Get more of it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. Our least expensive tier is $3.50 per month, but it doesn't mean you will get less. We let people contribute what they wish to or can, and everyone gets everything that is on our page. Because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. If you join, you will gain access to various new features. For example, you will have the option to listen to all episodes with or without background sounds, and you will have the capability to download all these episodes and participate in selecting future topics. We also offer advance releases and updates on upcoming episodes. As of today, there are 17 stories available only to our patrons, and we add a new one every month. We have added links to Patreon as well as links to different streaming options, which may be better suited for you. You will find a link in the description of the episode. But before we begin, let's pause briefly to center ourselves before we embark on this shared exploration. If you're willing, allow your eyes to softly close, letting the day's worries fade into the background. Settle into a position that feels right for you, maybe shifting slightly until everything aligns just so. Take a slow, nurturing breath, and as you gently exhale, observe how your body naturally responds. Allow a wave of relaxation to cascade from your shoulders through your neck, dissolving any lingering stress. Let your face soften, your jaw unclench, your hands rest naturally, and your legs become fully supported. And as you sink into this tranquil space, I'll be here as your gentle guide while we begin our journey together. Let's begin with our first destination, Easter Island. Easter Island is a small, triangular island in the South Pacific, and it has been inhabited for at least 800 years. We will come back to this, but we are going to begin our story 300 years ago, in 1722, when the first European expedition reached the island. A Dutch ship that arrived on an Easter Sunday, hence the name. Its local name is Rapa Nui, which is also the name of its inhabitants, the Rapa Nui, and their language. The Dutch spent about a week on the island, and at the time they estimated its population to around 2,000 to 3,000 people. They also noticed alignments of large and strange statues near the shores, statues of tall faces showing their backs to the sea and looking towards the inside of the island. At the time in the 18th century, maps of the Pacific Ocean and its countless islands, separated by hundreds or sometimes thousands of miles of ocean. This was all being explored and mapped. So after a week or so, this Dutch expedition left, and for 50 more years, no other European ship visited Easter Island until 1770, when two Spanish ships reached the island and claimed it as a possession of Spain, which at the time still had a gigantic empire in the Americas that went from what would become the west coast of the United States all the way south to what is now Argentina and Chile. So Easter Island was claimed by Spain, but this ownership remained rather theoretical because the island was not occupied and it was too small and too remote for other nations to even care and recognize this claim. One thing we know about the island between these two visits, though, is that when the Spanish ships arrived in 1770, some of the statues on the shore that the Dutch had noticed in 1722, 50 years earlier, had now fallen, suggesting that something may have gone wrong in between these two dates. Maybe a war, maybe a drop in population. The next visit was 4 years later, and this time it was the expedition of a famous British explorer, James Cook. Famous in particular for his exploration voyages in the Pacific, including the first recorded European trip around New Zealand, the first to come into contact with the eastern coast of Australia, and the first to reach the Hawaiian Islands. So Cook also made a quick stop on Easter Island, and other expeditions after him, one French, one Russian, and we know from the records established by their crews that by the late 18th century and early 19th century, the state of the statues continued to deteriorate. They had now all fallen. So something seems to have gone wrong along the 18th century on Easter Island. But no one really cared to investigate this because the island was very remote and very far from any strategic route. The closest continental shore was in Chile, but that was more than 2,000 miles to the east. A bit closer to Easter Island, but still fairly far, was French Polynesia, 1,600 miles away. Actually, Easter Island is one of the most isolated pieces of land on Earth. If we consider the distance to other islands or continents, this could have made it a good port, a good stopover for a commercial route. But at the time, there was very little to no intercontinental traffic in the South Pacific. Ships traveled far to the north, which resulted in Easter Island's location having little significance. At the beginning of the 19th century, Spain lost most of its American empire as Latin American countries declared and fought for their independence. And with this loss, Spain no longer claimed Easter Island. Actually, no one did. And apart from the occasional exploration and mapping expedition, the inhabitants were left alone. Until 1860, when a human and demographic disaster struck. Raiders came from Peru, more than 2,000 miles away. Raiders seeking captives for enslavement and export. Slavery had been abolished recently in Peru in 1854, and the practice had mostly disappeared. But there were still places where the law was not enforced yet, and traffickers would take advantage of this. The deportation of Easter Island natives was discovered. There were protests both nationally and internationally, and after several years, the survivors were freed and allowed to return to their island. But with them, they brought diseases that the island had apparently always been spared, like smallpox. The natives were not protected against these bacteria and viruses, and so the population dropped and came close to disappearing. By the late 1860s, the population of Easter Island had declined to only a few dozen residents, compared to an estimated 1,500 individuals just a few years earlier. There had already been signs of a slow decline on Easter Island before 1860. The statues had fallen. The population had probably decreased from 2,000 to 3,000 in 1722 to half that number by 1860. But this sudden drop that almost eradicated the Rapa Nui was a complete disaster. The island was now almost empty, and in 1880 it was annexed by the closest country, Chile, to which it still belongs. So why is there a mystery here? And why is this name, Easter Island, famous around the world for what is, after all, just a tiny and remote island? Easter Island is special for several reasons that started to be studied in the 20th century. First, as I told you, the island is separated from any other livable land by hundreds of miles of ocean in every direction. So how could the inhabitants arrive there? Many islands around the world were discovered free of human presence, many of them much more accessible than Easter Island. How did the first inhabitants manage to cross such a distance? Second, there is this large collection of statues. Some of them are huge and can weigh up to 80 tons. There is the question of their meaning, their reason to be, but also of how an isolated group reaches such a level of technical achievement. It is generally admitted that for a human culture to reach a certain technical and cultural level, it needs to be in contact with other groups. First, to exchange ideas and practices, and second, because the probability of discoveries and innovation is much higher in larger groups with more individuals. Generally, technical advancement comes with cities or towns, but there was nothing of this here. No contact with the outside world. A small population, because the island could not sustain more than a few thousand inhabitants at once. It is conceivable that settlers reached the island equipped with the necessary technical expertise and cultural heritage to construct these statues. However, a comparison with the nearest human populations reveal no comparable characteristics. They are strikingly unique to this place, and their culture was not limited to the statues. They also had elaborated a system of glyphs, possibly a form of writing called Rongo Rongo, which has not been found in any other location. So, what happened at Easter Island? How is it possible? This is the mystery. The question of how these accomplishments were achieved becomes even more complex given that during the 19th century, when expeditions to Easter Island increased, the island's resources were notably scarce. There was not a single tree standing, and not a single spring of fresh water. The only reserves of water on the island were volcanic lakes. The island was formed by 3 volcanoes, which is why it has this triangular shape. And on top of these volcanoes, in their craters, lakes of rainwater had formed. So, no metal, no wood, not much to work with for irrigation, to practice agriculture, limited space and population. How was such cultural and technical advancement possible? Where did the population come from? Did they arrive with an already advanced material culture? Or was Easter Island very different centuries ago? Or was it possibly the remains of a larger island, a larger culture, or even a larger continent that would have been submerged? These are some of the questions that scientists and the archaeologists started to study in the 20th century. These mysteries are also the reason why various myths and legends developed around Easter Island. The most famous is related to a supposedly lost continent, Mu, M-U. This mythical continent was first mentioned in the 19th century. It is not that old, and it seems it was invented by an American antiquarian, Augustus Le Planchon. He was specialized in Mesoamerican cultures, especially from Yucatan, the heart of Mayan culture. He was in contact with a lot of Maya artifacts and documents. This is real. And from there, he elaborated a number of claims. These claims were never, and still are not, taken seriously by scholars because they are unsubstantiated and they sound quite hard to believe. So he claimed that he had translated the first copies of the Popol Vuh, a text recounting the history and mythology of the Quiche, a group of peoples that belonged to a broader Maya culture. And he claimed, based on this text, that the civilization of Yucatan was actually much older than thought, even older than that of Egypt, and that it came from a lost continent. A continent that Le Plongeon located in the Atlantic, not in the Pacific, and he identified this continent as Atlantis, the well-known mythical continent. At the time, in the 19th century, Atlantis was going through a surge in popularity among occultists and pseudo-archaeologists. But he didn't call this continent Atlantis. He called it Mu. And he got this name from a French ethnographer and archaeologist who had translated other Maya texts and noticed that these texts spoke of a land he called Mu, that would have been submerged by a catastrophe. Le Plongeon went to imagine that Mu, or Atlantis, would have been somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. Thousands of years ago, refugees escaped to the east, and they would have settled in North Africa, becoming the ancestors of the Egyptians, and to the west, populating America north and south. And they would have founded the Maya civilization. Few people took that seriously in the 19th century, and even less today, because nothing proves these affirmations, and records actually show that they are not serious archaeological remains. Texts, linguistics, DNA studies, cultural comparisons, geology, because now we know what the bottom of the Atlantic looks like. All of these disciplines indicate that there was never a continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and that ancient American, African, and European cultures could not come from there. They had other origins that are not always perfectly known. There are still question marks, but these origins are at least identified. Still, the name Mu, or Land of Mu, had been put out there, and in the following decades, other authors popularized it further and moved it from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. The most notable of these authors was a British writer and inventor called James Churchward. These various authors, who operated at the limits of fiction, fantasy, and alternative history, imagined different stories about Mu. The one Churchward came up with was that the continent of Mu was once the home of an advanced civilization, and even an advanced race of humans that would have flourished 50,000 to 12,000 years ago. That is to say, long before the earliest known civilizations. To sustain his theory of a lost continent in the Pacific, he gave a lot of coincidences, some real, and many others invented. For example, that visual motifs or similar sounding words could be repeated between different cultures. And he mentioned the Rapa Nui among them, suggesting that the Rapa Nui, the inhabitants of Easter Island, were descendants of this lost civilization. Easter Island being the southeast tip of this gigantic submerged continent, a tiny region of it that would have miraculously survived. And so, the apparent advancement of Easter Island with its glyphs and its statues would be a remain, a decadent remain, probably, of this lost civilization. The problem is that this was all invented. There was no proof and no reason to believe that an isolated man with a lot of imagination had made such a groundbreaking discovery without even doing research on the site he claimed to have deciphered. And it didn't help either that other authors also came up with completely different legends about Mu. The location, the shape, the origin story. It was always different. Ultimately, the advancement of cartography and depth-sounding technologies rendered these narratives obsolete. When the ocean floor was mapped, it appeared that the islands that dotted the Pacific were often volcanic islands or coral islands, not the emerged parts of a landmass that would have been submerged thousands of years ago. So probably no lost continent of Mu in the Pacific. But this was also how Easter Island's reputation as a mysterious place built up and entered popular culture. In the 20th century, the way humans, and especially the Polynesians, had colonized the Pacific was better understood too, and it appeared, based on languages and DNA, that the inhabitants of Easter Island, the Rapa Nui, were Polynesians. Like other Polynesians, they had colonized islands that were hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles apart, on relatively small boats, traveling between them with food reserves, following navigation routes, thanks to their practical knowledge of astronomy. What is unknown is when the first Polynesians arrived at Easter Island. At the latest, it had to be in the 12th century, which is to say 600 years before the first European expedition put the island on a map. We know this because the statues, they are called moai, were dated from the 12th to the 16th centuries. But settlement on the island could have been as early as the 4th or 5th centuries AD. We don't know. But the first inhabitants arrived here as they were deliberately looking for a new land where to settle. Polynesians did this, and it is how they progressively colonized a large part of the Pacific, or they would have accidentally arrived if a storm or navigation error took them away from their intended destination, and after long wandering, they would have ended on Easter Island. This is unknown, but what is certain is that once the island was occupied, it remained constantly populated, and the statues, the moais, began to be erected over a long period of 3 centuries. They also have a lot to reveal about the Rapa Nui. The moais represent human beings, obviously stylized with big heads that appear elongated on relatively small bodies. Bodies that consist essentially of torsos with arms on the side, but no legs. Their sizes and weights vary a lot, from 5 tons up to 80 tons. There is even one estimated to weigh 200 tons and to be 69 feet tall, 21 meters, called El Gigante, the giant. But it was discovered still in the quarry and unfinished. It never made it to its intended destination. Over 1,000 moai statues have been identified, and with the exception of a small number that have been relocated to museums, the majority, including the largest examples, remain on Easter Island. They were sculpted, carved in volcanic stone, and always in a single block. But after they were extracted from quarries and transported to their destination, at least some of them received eyes made of coral and a kind of hat, a cylinder made of red stone called a pukao. Many moais were placed aligned on stone platforms that could hold up to 15 statues, and they were placed to look inland, not toward the sea. These statues on stone platforms are the ones that apparently fell during the 18th and 19th centuries, as observed by foreign expeditions, to the point by the mid-19th century they had all fallen. Why were these moais built? According to Rapa Nui traditions, the statues could contain the spirits of their ancestors, serving as containers so that they stayed close to their descendants and could help them. This would be coherent with the monoliths found around Polynesia. Monoliths that are not as large as moais and not carved to look human. Several experts believe that there was this religious tradition in some parts of Polynesia. The funerary practice of building such monoliths to anchor the spirits of the dead ancestors. The moais would be a local variation, a spectacular one, of this practice. That does sound like a seducing theory, but it is not 100% certain. Because first, the moais looked markedly different from other Polynesian relics on other islands. They don't look human. And second, because the modern Rapa Nui stories or traditions cannot be taken literally. A lot of things happened on Easter Island before and after the arrival of foreign explorers. We know that the population declined dramatically so in the 1860s. Many inhabitants were deported. But there had already been a slower decline before that, a demographic decline, and also a cultural or material one. Because the last moai were erected in the 1500s, 200 years before the first European expedition arrived. After that, during the 18th century and possibly before, the moais were no longer maintained. They all tumbled. Was it due to the lack of resources in time or in energy to restore them or maintain them? Or was it because the belief system that justified their creation changed or was interrupted somehow? Or maybe because of conflicts? What if the moais were intentionally toppled? We don't know. But it is possible that the intentions or the beliefs of the creators of the moais were forgotten at some point, and that they kept their secret with them, and that later generations of Rapa Nui created another interpretation of this heritage. In any case, a form of decline happened on Easter Island in the 19th century, obviously due to foreign interference, but it had started before. So what happened? Here again we have various possibilities. The first one appears in the oral tradition of the island in the form of tales about the past. They speak of a time long ago when there were two populations coexisting on the island. One called the long ears, that would have been dominant, and the second one called the short ears. What is unclear is whether these two populations were two different peoples, with the Rapa Nui being the short ears dominated people, or if these were more like social classes and they were all Rapa Nui. But the legend says that the short ears were forced by the long ears to serve them, including building the moais for them. If there is some truth to it, it could suggest that at least at some point there were different factions on the island and conflicts between them, or that foreigners arrived and subdued the Rapa Nui Some have suggested that in that case, the long ears could have come from South America, and that's not technically impossible, but it sounds implausible because the distance is huge, more than 2,000 miles of ocean, without any stop in between. The pre-Columbian cultures in South America are not known to have ever gone very far on the Pacific Ocean, and also there is zero archaeological proof of this. This is why the scientific community tends to reject this possibility of several peoples living on the island and considers that these tales are either not historically reliable or that the different factions they speak of are more social classes or rival groups, tribes, rather than different peoples. But what seems true, speaking of conflicts, is that the population of Easter Island, even when it comprised 2,000 or 3,000 individuals at the beginning of the 18th century, was not unified. There were always clans of a few hundred people, and as the island had limited resources, as we have seen, you can easily imagine the power keg that it could have become. It seems that the clans had found a way of coexisting by sharing resources. At least this is what the first foreign accounts of the Rapa Nui population, the Dutch one from 1722, suggests. At the time, they had a ritual, a religious ceremony in which every clan would choose a champion. The champions competed. They had to swim to a tiny island off the coast of the main island and bring back an egg from a nest on this island. The fastest champion gave his clan the role of allocating the resources among the various factions until a new challenge was organized. This social organization dominated in the 18th century, but at the time the creation of moais had stopped, and it seems that there had already been an economic and demographic decline on Easter Island. This led experts to believe that maybe there was a different kind of society when the moais were built, and that a revolution or a quick and drastic change happened at some point, because it is hard to explain why the production of moais could be suddenly interrupted if there was not a broader change. An old theory of the 20th century about this is the one that explains the decline of Easter Island by an ecological collapse, an over-intensive exploitation of resources that would have ruined the island. You remember that the Dutch were surprised when they first arrived that the island did not have trees. This is not common for volcanic islands in the South Pacific. Typically, such islands with a mild climate like Easter Island would be covered by forest. And it is very likely that at some point there was wood, a lot of wood on the island, because the moai had to be moved and lifted. And the only possibility to move around such big blocks of rock was to use logs to make them roll or use sledges. But in any case, it takes wood. Hence the idea, the theory that the making of the moai and other human activities for generations would have completely exhausted the island's wood resources until the very last tree was cut down. And that would explain why the Rapa Nui stopped making moai, and also explain the poverty of the population. No wood means no rafts to go fishing, no or limited fuel to burn, to make crafts, to cook food. The inhabitants lived essentially on fishing and hunting birds, or gathering their eggs and seashells when the island was discovered. So, did the Rapa Nui self-destroy by exhausting their natural resources to a point of no return? Possibly. But this still has to be taken as a hypothesis, because there could also be natural causes to deforestation, including a natural phenomenon called El Nino that affects this part of the Pacific and has an impact on the weather to the point that it can affect vegetation negatively for several years in a row. It could have contributed to this decline. Another possible explanation is internal conflicts, wars between factions that would have accelerated deforestation, to make weapons, to build walls, or because each side was maybe trying to destroy the other side's resources. Maybe there was a combination of these factors: human induced, ecological collapse, and war, possibly working as a vicious cycle, each one amplifying the other. And this is the heart of the mystery of Easter Island. Somehow, in this isolated and remote part of the world, a human society of a few hundred or a few thousand souls went through a process of decline, either because of self-destruction or because the setback was due to external factors like the climate. And they had to find a precarious new balance on an island that was now devoid of resources, especially with no wood left. And there they lived for several generations, possibly still in occasional conflicts among the spectacular remains left by their ancestors. These extraordinary statues that dwarfed any other statues around the Pacific. We don't know exactly what happened, but a mysterious tragedy took place on Easter Island, either in the form of a sudden collapse between the 16th and the 18th centuries, or a long decline. Only the moai could tell us, if they could speak. We are not done yet. We have other mysteries to discover. I told you about this 19th century legend that enrolled Easter Island as a remain of the legendary continent of Mu. So, speaking of legendary lost continents, let's move several thousand miles to the west, near a Japanese island called Yonaguni, to take a look at a rock formation that has sparkled a lot of interest since its discovery in the 1980s, the Yonaguni Monument. Yonaguni is a small island with a population of a few hundred people. Even though it belongs to Japan, it is also close to Taiwan, about 60 miles, 100 kilometers east. It is a popular diving location because the sea is relatively shallow there, and there is a large population of hammerhead sharks. These are small to medium-sized sharks that are generally not dangerous to humans. They are also not aggressive at all, and their small mouths are more adapted to eating fish than attacking large prey. So divers visit this location, and in 1986, one of them noticed some strange seabed formations while swimming, actually resembling architectural structures like steps, possibly the base of walls or the first levels of a pyramid, maybe, or terraces. The site is 26 meters, about 85 feet underwater, so it is easily accessible. Shortly thereafter, a group of scientists came to examine the structure and map it. It is unusual indeed, and it looks ambiguous. At certain angles, it could look like the ruins of a monument built in large stone blocks, like, for example, what the pre-Columbians did in the Andes. At other angles, it looks more like a regular natural seabed rock formation. It has straight angles forming these steps and terraces that make them look intentional. And at the same time, the whole structure, which is about 75 meters long, 220 feet, and 25 meters high, 85 feet, does not really look like any other known form of architecture. Some of the steps are small and others are enormous. There is no symmetry anywhere, no apparent purpose to the structure, if it was artificial. It does not consist of individual blocks that had been deliberately arranged or stacked. The few blocks the structure is made of are connected to the rest of the seabed. So if it was intentional, the site would not have been really built, but rather carved into an existing rock formation, which is technically possible, but seems overly complicated. But what is also true is that this site was possibly not submerged a few thousand years ago. It could date, according to some, from the last glaciation. And when water rose, or if a seismic phenomenon happened, it would have been submerged. This is controversial and not admitted as a fact by the scientific community. But it is possible, hypothetically, and the whole mystery of the Yonaguni Monument comes from these ambiguities. Was it an emerged site a few thousand years ago? Possibly. And more importantly, is it an artificial, intentional rock structure or just a natural one? The argument in favor of its artificial nature is its appearance, obviously. And yes, it is striking, at least at first glance, because when you start paying more attention, the structure lacks a sense of purpose. Steps do not seem to lead anywhere, and if it was the foundation of something, there should be holes to put poles in it, or stone blocks that were piled up above. But there is nothing like that. And actually, aside from the right angles of the steps, there are no additional features that appear to have been deliberately carved in this structure. One possibility could be that long ago, the site served as a quarry. There was a long tradition of stone building in the nearby islands, and maybe, if the site was emerged thousands of years ago, it could have provided stone blocks that would explain the shape. But a good question is, are there other sites or other rock formations in the world that are of natural origin but look man made or intentional? And the answer is yes. Right angles and geometric shapes in general can appear naturally. For example, walls of basaltic rock that look like organ pipes. It is a volcanic rock, and these hexagonal shapes appear when they cool down. Now, the rocks at Yonaguni are not basalt. They do not come from volcanoes. These are sedimentary, but still. Various geologists who examined the site reported that it was unusual indeed, but that it could be natural. Supporters of the artificial theory argue that the general shape of the site looks like an oval. The number of steps and what looks like a kind of pathway, a road around it, points to its artificial origin, and that it could have been a kind of castle or a temple, or both. Defenders of this theory dated the site to at least 2,000 to 3,000 years old, up to 10,000 years old. Now, these datings make a big difference if we think of their implications for archaeology. If the site was artificial and 2,000 to 3,000 years old, it would be a curiosity indicating that this region was emerged back then and had a more developed and thoughtful, a more advanced use of stone architecture. Nothing else, because 2,000 years ago, civilizations building stone monuments already existed in Asia, especially in China. But if the site was 10,000 years old, that would be another story, and it would not be compatible with the timeline established by the scientific consensus of historians and archaeologists. That's why the Yonaguni Monument quickly turned into one of the recurring arguments for pseudo archaeological theories that generally state that civilization began much earlier than mainstream history says. These sort of narratives are not taken seriously by the scientific consensus because there is just no proof that civilizations that old ever existed in this region of the world. The rock formation could well be natural, could well have been submerged only a couple of thousand years ago, and only looks artificial from a few curated angles. This is not considered credible evidence. Actually, if you Google Yonaguni Monument and look at images, half of them on the internet are artists' views or AI generated pictures that do not represent the actual rock formation, but instead show submerged pyramids or fortresses. And I think it is like this because if you expect to see underwater ruins, the reality of the Yonaguni Monument is rather underwhelming. The actual site looks rather chaotic. It could have been man-made. There is no proof that it was not. But it takes a stretch of the imagination to see a temple or to see a castle in there. Still, the monument is at least a geological curiosity, and it raises questions about human civilization in Asia that still deserves to be at least studied. I know you like ghost ship stories, so here is one that happened in the Pacific Ocean. The story of the Joyita, an American vessel that mysteriously disappeared in 1955, only to reappear several weeks later with no crew. Instead, just clues about what had happened. Our story begins in 1931. The Joyita was named after a Hollywood actress of silent films, Jewel Carmen. Joyita in Spanish means little jewel. So the ship was built in Los Angeles, commissioned by a movie director, Ronald West. It was of respectable dimensions, 69 feet, 21 meters. The ship was sold to another owner in 1936, and during her first 10 years, the Joyita remained based in Los Angeles, essentially sailing along the Pacific coast from Mexico to the south to San Francisco to the north. In 1941, 2 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Joyita was acquired by the U.S. Navy and sent to Hawaii to serve as a patrol boat. She was used to patrol the big island of Hawaii and was not affected by the attack on Pearl Harbor. That's how she spent the rest of World War II, as a patrol boat. When the war ended, the ship was no longer needed. Most of her equipment was removed, and she ended up being sold in 1948, returning to private owners. She changed hands a couple of times again until she ended up as a trading and fishing charter boat in Samoa, almost 5,000 miles away from her birthplace in California. And so the Joyita was now used to transport goods and passengers between islands, or occasionally fish, depending on how profit could be made. In the 1950s, there were few small planes. Helicopters were not common. So these small boats that could transport a few people at a time were very useful. On October 3rd, 1955, the Joyita left Samoa for such a trip, bound for the Tokelau Islands that are 270 miles away. She carried 25 people, 16 crew members and 9 passengers, including a government official, a surgeon on his way for an operation, 2 children, and a businessman. She also left Samoa with a cargo of timber, medical supplies, various foodstuffs, the usual goods that had to be transported between islands. The voyage was expected to last 40 to 48 hours, but departure was delayed a little bit because one of the 2 engines failed. However, that was not seen as a deal breaker, and the ship could travel with only 1 engine. And so, after 24 hours, as a repair would have taken too much time and there were passengers waiting, it was decided to leave Samoa on 1 engine. The ship was expected to arrive in the Tokelau Islands on the 5th of October, but it didn't happen. And on the 6th, a message came from the destination island signaling that she was overdue. No distress signal had been received, even though the ship had a radio. There had been strong winds, but no storm. So that was a bit puzzling, not necessarily alarming. Still, a search and rescue operation was launched. A large area was searched by the New Zealand Air Force for a week, but nothing was found. It seems the Joyita had vanished together with her crew and passengers. It could only be assumed that she had sunk for an unknown reason and searches had to be stopped. 5 weeks passed, and in November, when the ship was now considered lost, it suddenly reappeared. A merchant ship sighted the Joyita more than 600 miles west from her scheduled route, drifting in the Pacific. The ship was partially submerged and listing heavily, but still afloat. There was no trace of any of the passengers or the crew, and some of its cargo was missing too. The recovery party noticed that the radio was tuned to the International Radio Distress Channel. So apparently, there had been an attempt to call for help. But it appeared later, when the radio was examined, that a malfunction limited its range to a few miles, which probably explained why this signal was never heard by anyone, if it was ever sent. It was also noticed that all the rafts that the ship carried had gone missing, and so was the ship's logbook, its navigation instruments, and firearms that the captain kept. A doctor's bag was found on deck. There was a surgeon among the passengers, but it could be assumed that he kept his things in a cabin. So if the bag was on deck, there had been an attempt to use it somehow, and blood-stained bandages were also found, indicating that someone had been wounded at least. An investigation began to try and solve the puzzle of this ghost ship. It reminded one of a famous ghost ship, the Marie Celeste, a ship that had also lost its crew in the Atlantic Ocean, and no definitive explanation was ever found as to why people had evacuated a ship that was still able to float and was so much safer than lifeboats or rafts, apparently in a hurry. What had happened to the Joyita? 4 main scenarios emerged, and they all sound like possibilities with varying degrees of credibility. The first one would be that the captain died or became incapacitated for some reason, maybe a stroke or an accident, and maybe the bandages found on the deck were for him. The captain, Thomas Miller, was very experienced and familiar with the ship. He knew in particular that the hull would keep it afloat because it was really strong. And indeed, when the ship was discovered, the hull was not compromised. So according to all sailors who knew him, there was no way he would have ordered an evacuation of the ship. The idea that he had to be dead or incapacitated comes from the fact that the ship was evacuated for no good reason. The Joyita was taking in water due to a broken pipe, but that would not have been enough to make her sink. So the scenario would be that on top of this accident with the broken pipe, he died or was badly injured and lost consciousness. The crew and the passengers would have panicked and fled on the rafts, and then they would have gotten lost, while the Joyita would have kept drifting for several weeks. That's possible. but not a perfectly convincing explanation. First, because nothing proves the captain was incapacitated, and second, because that would not explain how some of the cargo disappeared. About 4 tons were missing, and that could not have been taken on rafts. So we have to imagine that either the passengers threw some of the cargo away for some reason, maybe in an attempt to make the ship lighter if they thought it was sinking, or that other people found the ship, took some of its cargo, but not everything, and let it go before it was finally discovered adrift. These things are possible, technically. That's a lot of speculation and unproven steps. Hypotheses to make the scenario work with the known material elements. So, hypothesis number 2. It could have been an insurance fraud organized by the captain. This was mentioned at the time as a possibility because the captain had amassed large debts, but it was never seen as a very credible option. First, because killing 25 people and organizing your own disappearance looks a bit over the top for a fraud that could also be organized by just scuttling the ship when there is no one on board in a port. And also the captain or his body never reappeared, so probably not insurance fraud. Hypothesis number 3 would be the possibility of a mutiny of the crew that would have turned for the worst. According to witnesses, there had been some animosity between Captain Miller and his second in command. But what could have triggered a fight and a mutiny could be these technical problems at the beginning of a flood on board. As mentioned, observing the ship's equipment, it appeared that a cooling pipe had broken, and this is how water started flooding the Joyita. Not enough to make her sink, as we saw, but that was still concerning. The pumps to evacuate this water would have malfunctioned, and the crew would have demanded the ship return to its port of origin. But the captain would have ordered to go on, leading to a revolt on board, a fight, and finally, with the captain no longer in charge, an evacuation. Now, the other members of the crew were not stupid. They may have not known the ship as well as Captain Miller, but it still seems unlikely that they would have abandoned the Joyita to try their luck on tiny rafts in the middle of the ocean. What could explain the evacuation in that case could be that they sighted an island or a reef and tried to reach it, but due to the strong winds, the rafts would have been carried away and the Joyita would have been left drifting with no one on board. Here again, it is technically possible, but it requires various intermediate hypotheses that are hard to prove. So instead of a fight or an accident of the Joyita explaining that she was abandoned, what if she was attacked by pirates? A Soviet submarine? In 1955, we are still in a phase of high tension in the Cold War. And why not by the Japanese? This theory of a Japanese attack gained credence when men clearing the Joyita found several knives that were stamped "Made in Japan." Obviously, the Second World War had been over for 10 years already. This was not a conventional attack, but two theories circulated at the time. The first was that the Joyita had passed near Japanese fishing boats and had seen something that the Japanese didn't want to be seen, whatever that meant. At the time, the anti Japanese sentiment in Oceania and the entire West Pacific was still relatively strong. The memory of the war was fresh. The second option, the Joyita had been attacked by Japanese soldiers operating from an isolated island base because they didn't know the war was over or they did not accept to stop fighting. It is true that this situation happened on islands occupied by the Japanese in the Pacific. Sometimes garrisons or isolated soldiers discovered months or years after the fact that the war was over because they had lost contact with the outside world. So it is not completely unthinkable. But no such secret base was ever found nearby, including in the decades following these events. And why would they have left the ship to escape with its precious cargo and equipment? Actually, the rumor that it was the Japanese quickly deflated when the knives were tested and it appeared that they were old and broken, probably left on board in the late 1940s at a time when the ship was used for fishing. For the same reason, the absence of proof, the theory of a Soviet submarine attack was discarded. A small merchant vessel with no one especially on board, no weapons, no valuable cargo, was not an attractive target for a Soviet warship. Remains the possibility of an attack by modern day pirates. But here again, the absence of pirate activity of that kind before and after, and the fact that only some of the things on board were taken, makes this hypothesis little credible. And on this series of observations and hypotheses, the investigation was closed, leaving the Joyita and its mystery unsolved. There are several possibilities, none of which is completely satisfactory, like for the Mary Celeste in the Atlantic. We have reached the end of our exploration journey for tonight. There are still other mysterious events and places around the Pacific Ocean, so maybe we will return one day in a future episode. You can now let go and sleep. Or if you're not sleepy yet, you can always pick another story from my ever growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.